34 years. That's how long I spent as a civil engineer for the state of Tennessee, calculating load tolerances and drainage coefficients and the exact weight that concrete can bear before it gives. I know a lot about structural integrity. I know what holds and what doesn't. I learned that lesson about buildings long before I learned it about family. The farmhouse cost me $310,000. That was 3 years after my wife passed, 2 years after I took early retirement, and about 6 months after my doctor told me my blood pressure was high enough to be a professional concern. I'd been renting an apartment in Nashville for most of those post-retirement years, drifting through the rooms of it like furniture nobody had arranged on purpose. My daughter called every Sunday. My brother called whenever he needed something, which was often enough that I'd learned to let it go to voicemail and listen first before deciding whether to call back. The farmhouse was in Giles County, built in 1887, according to the county assessor's records, though the previous owner insisted it was 1883 and had a framed newspaper clipping on the wall that didn't quite prove either date. It sat on 11 acres of rolling pasture and second-growth hardwood, with a creek that ran along the eastern property line and a covered porch that faced west, which meant that in the evenings, when the light came down through the trees and turned the field to something close to gold, I could sit in the wooden rocker I'd bought at an auction in Pulaski and feel like the world had stopped moving long enough for me to catch my breath. I paid cash. 34 years of paychecks and careful living and a modest inheritance from my mother had built something in a savings account that I'd never touched, because there was never anything I wanted badly enough to disturb it. Until the farmhouse. Until I walked through those rooms, for the first time, with the realtor, and stood in the kitchen with its original pine floors and its view of the back pasture, and thought, this is what I was saving for. I just didn't know it until now. I spent the first 8 months living in the guest bedroom while I restored the main bedroom. I am not a contractor by trade, but I understand structures, and I hired good people for the work I couldn't do myself and learned fast on the rest. I refinished the floors. I rebuilt the front porch railing. I sourced period-appropriate hardware from an architectural salvage place in Chattanooga and drove up there twice with the truck bed empty and came back both times with it full. I planted a kitchen garden in the side yard and killed most of it the first season and replanted and paid closer attention the second time. By the end of the first year, I had a home. Not just a house. A home, for the first time since my wife had been alive, in a way that I hadn't expected to feel again. My brother came to visit in the spring of the second year. He drove up from Huntsville, where he'd been living for the past decade with my sister-in-law and their 2 teenage boys. I cooked a rack of ribs on the smoker I'd built into the side of the barn, and we sat on the porch and watched the light go down, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the version of the evening matched the version of it I'd imagined. My brother seemed genuinely happy for me. He walked the property with his hands in his pockets and asked good questions about the renovation work and nodded when I explained what I'd done with the drainage on the north field. He seemed like himself. The version of himself I'd grown up with, anyway, before the money problems and the business ideas and the string of ventures that had never quite landed. He asked, almost offhandedly, as we were loading his overnight bag into his truck the next morning, "You ever think about renting this place out? Even part of the time?" I said I hadn't. I said the whole point was that it was mine. He said, sure, and drove away. I thought that was the end of it. My sister-in-law called 3 weeks later. She was cheerful, in the particular way she gets when she wants something, a brightness in her voice that sits slightly higher than her normal register, like she's performing a version of herself that she thinks I'll respond to better than the real one. She asked about the house. She asked about the garden. She told me my nephews were growing fast, and that the older one was looking at colleges and that things were tight. You know how it is. Everything costs so much more than it used to. I said I understood, because I did, and because I wasn't yet sure what she was building toward. She got there eventually. She'd been researching, she said. Vacation rentals in rural Tennessee were doing very well. The demand for authentic, historic properties was particularly strong. A place like mine, 11 acres, original structure, proximity to the Natchez Trace, could reasonably generate between $40,000 and $60,000 a year on one of the major platforms, depending on the season and the booking strategy. I said that was interesting. She said she and my brother had been talking, and they thought they could manage it. The listing, the guest communication, the cleaning, all of it. I wouldn't have to do anything. They'd handle everything. And they'd give me a cut of the revenue. She used the word generous twice in the same sentence, which I've noticed people tend to do when the number they have in mind isn't actually generous. I asked what percentage. She said 20%. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. My property, my 11 acres, my farmhouse that I paid $310,000 for and spent another $80,000 restoring. My driveway and my well and my septic system and my roof that I had replaced 18 months ago for $22,000. 20% of whatever they decided to charge strangers to sleep in the rooms I had rebuilt with my own hands. I told her I'd think about it. I said it calmly, because I've learned over the years that calm is more useful than anger in the opening stages of a problem. Anger tells the other person where your pressure points are. Calm keeps them guessing. She said, "That's great, Walter. I really think this could work well for everyone." I called my brother that evening. I told him directly that I was not interested in renting the property to anyone, under any arrangement, and that I was sorry if that was disappointing, but it was not something I was going to revisit. I told him the house was my home and my retirement and the first thing I'd built for myself since his sister-in-law had died, and I needed it to be mine without complication. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're being selfish." I said, "I'm being a property owner." He said, "You're out there alone and you've got all that space and you're not even using most of it. You're sitting on a gold mine and you won't even consider helping your family." I told him that owning something and not renting it to other people was not the same as refusing to help family. I told him that if he needed financial help, I was willing to have a different conversation, but that conversation wouldn't involve my home. He hung up before I finished the sentence. My daughter called that Sunday, as she always does. She'd heard from my brother. I didn't ask how. I already knew how, and she said, gently, the way she says things when she's trying to keep the peace, "Dad, I'm not saying you should do it. I just wonder if maybe you could hear them out a little more. They're in a hard spot." I said I had heard them out. I'd heard them out completely. My answer was no. She said, "Okay, Dad. I just wanted to mention it." I said, "I know. I love you." She said she loved me too. And we talked about her kids and her job and the garden for another 40 minutes. And I hung up feeling like I was standing on solid ground even though I could feel something shifting underneath it. The calls from my brother stopped. That was in September. By November, I hadn't heard from him in 2 months, which was unusual enough that I noticed it, but not unusual enough to worry me. We'd had periods of silence before, usually following one of his business proposals that I'd declined to invest in. He would be cold for a while, and then he would surface again, warmer than before, and we'd pick up where we'd left off, without ever directly addressing the interruption. It was a pattern. I knew the pattern well. What I didn't know, in November, was that he wasn't in a period of silence. He was in a period of preparation. I found out by accident. A friend of mine, a man I'd worked with for 12 years at the state, now also retired and living over in Lawrence County, called me on a Thursday afternoon to ask a question that he treated like small talk. "Hey, I saw a listing online for a farmhouse that looked a lot like yours. Historic property, Giles County, 11 acres. Is that yours? You renting it out now?" I said I wasn't. He said, "Well, there's a listing on one of those vacation rental sites. Nice pictures. Let me send you the link." He sent it while we were still on the phone. I opened it and sat down on the porch steps without meaning to, the way your legs go out from under you when something hits you in a place you weren't guarding. It was my house, my porch, my kitchen with the original pine floors, my view of the back pasture in the evening light. 12 photographs, all of them mine, all of them beautiful in the way the place genuinely was. Beautiful. The listing price was $220 a night with a 3-night minimum. It had been active for 11 days. There were 14 reviews already, all 5 stars. All cheerful, all describing a peaceful, historic farmhouse in the Tennessee countryside, exactly as advertised. 14 bookings in 11 days. My brother had been renting my home to strangers for 11 days without telling me, without asking, without any communication at all since September. He had a key I'd given him after his first visit, in good faith, the way you give family a key because you trust them. He had used it to let strangers into my home. He had collected their money and responded to their messages and managed their check-ins and listed my home as a vacation rental, as though ownership were a technicality he could simply route around. I sat on those steps for a long time, long enough for the light to change and the field to go from gold to gray. I had the phone in my hand and I could have called him. I could have called my daughter. I could have called a dozen people. I didn't call any of them. I called my attorney. I want to explain something about how I handled what came next, because I've thought about it a lot since then, and I want to be honest about my reasoning. I did not call my brother and yell at him. I did not drive to Huntsville to confront him. I did not post about it or tell everyone I knew or respond to the listing in any way that would have tipped him off that I knew. I made one phone call to a man I'd worked with on property disputes during my engineering career, a real estate attorney based in Columbia who had handled a case for me when I'd had a boundary dispute with a neighbor 3 years earlier. I explained what had happened. I told him what I needed. He said, "Walter, you've got a strong case. He has no legal right to any of this. But I want to ask you something first." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "How do you want this to end? Because that determines how we proceed." I thought about that. I thought about my brother and the version of him I'd grown up with and the version he'd become. I thought about the morning he'd stood in my field with his hands in his pockets and seemed genuinely happy for me. I thought about my sister-in-law and her careful cheerfulness and the word generous said twice in a row. I thought about strangers sleeping in my restored farmhouse, leaving 5-star reviews about a property that wasn't my brother's to rent. I said, I want him to understand that I meant what I said, and I want the bookings stopped. My attorney said, "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." Over the next 3 weeks, I did several things quietly and without my brother's knowledge. The first was that I had the locks changed on every exterior door, with new deadbolts keyed differently from anything I'd given out before. I did not tell my brother. I did not tell my daughter. I told the locksmith, who asked no questions and did his work and left. The second was that I had a security camera system installed at all 4 corners of the house and at the entrance to the driveway. 12 cameras total, all connected to cloud storage, all accessible from my phone. The installer asked if I wanted to put up signs indicating the property was under surveillance. I said yes. I wanted every sign he had. The third was that my attorney drafted a cease and desist letter that documented the unauthorized listings, the 14 completed bookings, and the ongoing use of my property without consent. It was addressed to my brother by his full legal name and his home address in Huntsville. It detailed the applicable Tennessee statutes regarding unauthorized rental of another person's property and outlined the financial liability he had accrued. It was 4 pages long, and it was very clear, and it did not leave any ambiguity about where things stood legally. The fourth was that I drove to the Giles County Sheriff's Office and had a conversation with a deputy. I'll call a professional acquaintance, someone I'd interacted with during a drainage project that had touched county land a few years back. I explained the situation. I showed him the listing, the photographs, the booking history I'd managed to document. I asked what my options were if someone arrived at my property with the expectation of renting it under a booking my brother had made without my authorization. The deputy was helpful. He told me what trespass looked like under Tennessee law, and what the response process was, and what I would need to have in place to make it straightforward. The fifth thing I did was the one that took the most patience. I waited. I waited because the listing showed a booking for the first weekend of December, a Friday to Sunday reservation, 2 adults and a dog, for which my brother had already collected a deposit. I knew they were coming. I had the dates, the check-in time, all of it from the listing platform's public-facing confirmation system, which my brother had apparently not thought to make private. I also sent my brother the cease and desist letter. Certified mail, tracked delivery. He signed for it on a Tuesday. He called me within the hour. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring again. He texted me, "Walter, I need to talk to you. Call me back." Then, "This is ridiculous. We are family." Then, I have guests booked. I can't just cancel. Then, you are blowing this completely out of proportion. I read all of them. I didn't respond to any of them. My attorney had advised me not to engage directly at this stage, and beyond the legal reasoning, I found that I didn't have anything I wanted to say. I had said what I wanted to say in September, on the phone, clearly and directly, and it had not been heard. A cease and desist letter was a different kind of saying, one designed for people who don't listen to the ordinary kind. My daughter called on Sunday. I could tell from her voice that she'd talked to my brother. She said, "Dad, I heard about the letter. Are you really going to do this?" I said, "I already did it." She said, "He says he thought you'd come around. He says he was trying to help the family." I said, "He was renting my home to strangers without asking me. He knew my answer, and he did it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did he really already have 14 bookings?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh." There was a longer quiet. Then she said, "Okay, Dad, I understand." That okay meant something different from the one in September. The September one had been diplomatic. This one was a line being crossed, in the right direction. The Friday evening in December was cold and clear in a way that Tennessee does in early winter, the kind of cold that makes the stars look closer. I was at the farmhouse. I had been there since Wednesday, which I made a point of mentioning to no one. I had the lights on in the main room and a fire in the fireplace and a pot of soup on the stove, because I live there. It is my home, and I cook soup on cold evenings, whether anyone is watching or not. At 5:47 in the evening, a white SUV turned off the county road and came up my driveway. I watched it on my phone, through the camera at the gate, a couple, probably mid-30s, and what appeared to be a medium-sized dog pressed against the back window with the focused energy of a dog who has been in a car for too long and knows it's almost over. They parked in the gravel area near the barn. They got out, and the woman looked at her phone and looked at the house and smiled at the man, the way people smile when something matches the pictures they were promised. The dog tumbled out after them and put its nose immediately to the ground. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The woman looked up and her smile shifted, not disappearing, just recalibrating. The way you recalibrate when the detail in front of you doesn't match the story you've been told. "Hi," she said. "We're here for the weekend booking. Is this the Giles County Farmhouse listing?" I said, "It is." "My name is Walter. I own this property." She said, "Oh, great. We're so excited to be here. The photos are just—" I said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to do it before you bring your bags in so we can sort this out as easily as possible. The person who booked this listing did not have authorization to rent this property. I did not list it, I did not agree to it, and I found out about it only recently. I'm very sorry you drove all this way under the expectation that this would be a normal rental stay." The man said, "I'm sorry, what?" I said, "The listing was created without my knowledge or consent by someone who has access to my property through a key I gave them as a family member. That key has since been changed. The listing has been reported to the platform and is in the process of being removed. I've been in contact with an attorney about the unauthorized rentals." The woman said, "Are you saying we can't stay here?" I said, "You can't stay here. I'm genuinely sorry. This isn't your fault, and you shouldn't have been put in this position." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly, "We paid $200 in deposit." I said, "I know. The person who took that money is my brother. His name is," and I gave them my brother's full name and his phone number, which my attorney had confirmed I was permitted to do. I also gave them a card my attorney had prepared, with the law firm's number and a brief explanation of the dispute, which they could use if they needed to pursue the deposit refund through the platform's dispute process. I said, "I would also suggest contacting the platform directly tonight. They've been notified about the unauthorized listing and should be processing a refund, but having you contact them directly will help move it faster." The woman looked at the card. The man looked at the house. The dog had wandered over to me and was sitting near my foot with the philosophical patience of a dog who understands that humans take longer to process things than they should. The man said, "This is really not what we expected." I said, "I know. I'm sorry. I want to be clear that nothing about this situation is your fault. They were gracious about it. In the end, the way people often are when they're given the full truth and treated with respect. They took the card. They put the dog back in the SUV. The woman paused before she got in and said, "I hope you get it sorted out." She said it like she meant it. I said, "I already have." I watched their taillights go down the driveway and turn onto the county road and disappear. Then I went inside and sat by the fire and finished the soup. My brother called 11 times that evening, starting around 6:15, which told me the couple had contacted him almost immediately, which was what I would have done in their position. I watched the calls come through on my phone and let each one go to voicemail. At some point, my sister-in-law's number showed up too, twice in a row. I let those go as well. My attorney had already notified the rental platform with the full documentation package, the property deed, the cease and desist correspondence, the proof of unauthorized listing, and the booking history. The listing was taken down by Saturday morning. 2 subsequent bookings that had been in the system were canceled by the platform, and those guests were refunded from whatever payment my brother had already received, something that was now between my brother, the platform, and whatever money he had put aside to manage the fallout. The platform also flagged his account. I don't know exactly what that means in their internal system, but my attorney indicated it would make it significantly more difficult for him to operate listings in the future. There were 2 more things that happened that weekend that I want to tell you about, because they matter to the story. The first was that my brother drove up on Saturday. I wasn't certain he would. I had considered that he might the hour and a half from Huntsville, the certainty that the listing had been killed, the 11 unanswered calls, and I had not changed my plan based on that consideration. When I saw his truck on the driveway camera at 10 in the morning, I felt something I want to be precise about. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was more like the feeling of a calculation completing. The result was already determined. All that remained was reading it out loud. I met him on the porch. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was wearing a jacket he'd had for years, the brown canvas one, and his face had the expression of a man who has been constructing an argument in the car for 90 minutes and is not entirely confident in it. He said, "Walter, we need to talk." I said, "We do." He said, "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed my family. That couple." I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "You rented my home without asking. You rented it after I told you no. You took money from strangers for the right to sleep in rooms I rebuilt with my own hands, and you gave me 20% of it in your head, which is the most generous part of the whole plan since you never mentioned it to me at all." He said, "We needed the money." I said, "That's not my home's problem." He said, "You're not even here most of the time." I said, "I'm here right now." He said, "You're being—" I said, "Careful." He stopped again. Whatever word was coming after being, it didn't come. He looked at the porch railing, the one I'd rebuilt, and then at the field, and then at a point somewhere between us that didn't correspond to anything physical. He said, quieter, "I thought you'd see it was a good idea once you saw it working." I said, "That is the most important thing you've said. You decided that what I wanted didn't matter because you were sure you knew better. You decided my answer wasn't final because you were confident your judgment outweighed mine. I want you to hear yourself say that." He didn't say anything. I said, "I'm 63 years old. I spent 34 years calculating how much weight things can hold. I know when something is structurally sound and when it isn't. What you did has structural damage to it, and I don't know yet how much of it can be repaired." He left without saying much after that. We didn't hug. We didn't shake hands. He walked back down the porch steps and got in his truck and sat in it for a while before he started the engine. I watched from the window, not because I was waiting for anything, but because it was my window and it was my view, and nobody was going to make me look away from it. The second thing that happened that weekend was that my daughter drove up on Sunday, unannounced, 4 hours from Nashville, appearing in my driveway at 11 in the morning with a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel. She said she just wanted to check on me. I said I was fine. She looked around the house, the floors, the windows, the view, and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "You really have made something here." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry, I suggested you hear them out more." I said, "You didn't know what they were planning. Neither did I then." She said, "Are you and your brother going to be okay?" I said, "I don't know. I hope so. But not if the price of okay is pretending this didn't happen the way it happened." She nodded. She has her mother's way of nodding when she's processing something, a small, specific movement that means she's taking it in rather than dismissing it. I've always appreciated that about her. We ate the casserole for lunch, and she stayed through the afternoon, and we walked the property together, down past the barn and along the creek and back up through the hardwoods, where the winter light came through the bare branches in long, pale lines. The dog she'd brought, a young shepherd mix she'd adopted 6 months ago, ran ahead of us and circled back and ran ahead again with the tremendous energy of a creature in its right environment. It was a good afternoon. The kind that doesn't ask you to feel more than you do or perform a resolution that hasn't happened yet. Just the land and the light and the company of someone who had driven 4 hours because she wanted to be there. That was 3 months ago. I want to tell you where things stand now, because I think the ending of a story should be honest rather than tidy. My brother and I have spoken twice since December. Both times were brief and careful, like two people walking on ice that they know has been tested, but aren't yet sure of. He has not apologized in words. He said once that he understands I was upset and that he should have communicated better, which is the version of an apology that avoids the acknowledgement of wrongdoing while gesturing in its direction. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I meant it, as far as it went. My sister-in-law has not called. I don't expect her to. I understand her role in this more clearly than my brother may want me to, and I think she understands that I understand it. That is its own kind of communication. My daughter calls every Sunday, same as always. She doesn't bring up my brother unless I do. When I do, she listens without coaching me toward any particular feeling about it. I am grateful for that. My attorney and I resolved the financial side of things in January. The platform had already processed refunds to affected guests, and a portion of those refunds came from monies my brother had collected. There was a separate matter regarding the 14 completed bookings before I found out guests who had paid, stayed, and left 5-star reviews for a property that wasn't my brother's to rent. The financial accounting of that is still being worked through, and I'll leave the details of it where they belong, which is with the attorneys. What I will tell you is that I updated my estate documents in January. My daughter knows what the property is worth, what my intentions for it are, and how it's structured going forward. I transferred it into a properly documented trust last fall, actually before any of this happened, during one of the quiet months when I was thinking about long-term planning, the way you do when you're 63 and you've watched people you love die, and you understand that orderly arrangements matter. The trust meant that my brother's listing of the property, beyond being unauthorized and ethically indefensible, had been legally complicated from the beginning in ways his attorney will have been glad to explain to him. I did not tell him about the trust. He found out through the cease and desist documentation, which listed the trust as the property's legal owner and me as its trustee. I imagine that was an educational moment. There is one more thing. The couple who arrived that December Friday, the ones with the dog, they sent me a message through the platform after everything was resolved to say that they'd been refunded and that they hoped the situation had worked out. They said the farmhouse had looked beautiful in the photos and they were sorry not to have been able to stay. They asked, genuinely and without expectation, whether it was ever rented to guests, because if I ever decided to do that, they'd love to be among the first to book. I wrote back and thanked them for their graciousness in a situation that wasn't their fault. I told them I didn't rent the property, that it was my home, and I intended to keep it that way. Then I put my phone down and went out to the back porch and sat in the rocker and looked at the field. The thing about this land, about the farmhouse and the creek and the 11 acres that I paid for, with 34 years of early mornings and careful saving, and the stubborn refusal to spend money on things I didn't need. Yet, the thing about it is that it is exactly what it is. It doesn't perform anything. The field doesn't become more golden because I need it to. The creek doesn't run quieter because I've had a hard week. The porch doesn't pretend to be warmer than it is. I have spent most of my professional life making sure that the structures I worked on would hold the weight they were given. Bridges and roadbeds and retaining walls, and the 100 invisible engineering decisions that keep the built world from collapsing on the people inside it. I was good at my job. I was careful and methodical, and I did not cut corners on the things that mattered, even when it would have been easier and cheaper to do so. I apply the same principle to my life now. My brother made a choice. He decided that what I'd said didn't matter, that my ownership of my own home was an inconvenience to his plans, that 63 and retired and living alone added up to someone whose answers could be waited out. He had 14 bookings in 11 days, and he thought that was the argument. He thought momentum was the same as permission. He thought that if he moved fast enough and got far enough along, the fact of it would override the refusal of it. He was wrong about the weight the structure could hold. I didn't yell. I didn't escalate. I documented and called professionals and changed the locks and waited. I met a couple on a cold Friday evening and told them the truth and gave them what they needed to be made whole and sent them back down the driveway with their deposit information and their dog and as much dignity as I could preserve in a situation my brother had created. I stood on my porch in December and told my brother what he had done in terms precise enough that he couldn't later claim not to have understood them. There is a version of this story where the ending is a reconciliation. Hugs and holiday dinners and a brother who learned his lesson and a family that came through intact on the other side. I'm not opposed to that version. I am willing to work toward it. But I am not willing to work toward it by pretending that what happened was smaller than it was, or that my no in September was somehow ambiguous, or that a man who spent 34 years calculating the structural limits of things should not have seen this coming the way he did. I sit on this porch, and I watch the light change over the field, and I listen to the creek, and I think about my wife, who would have had opinions about all of this that I would have wanted to hear. I think about my daughter, who drove 4 hours with a casserole on a Sunday because she understood what I needed without me having to say it. I think about the couple with the dog, who were gracious when they didn't have to be. And sometimes I think about my brother, the version from that spring morning, walking the field with his hands in his pockets, looking at the land I'd built for myself, and seeming genuinely glad that I had it. That man is still in there somewhere. I have to believe that, not because it's comforting, but because I knew him before the money problems and the business ideas and the particular kind of desperation that makes a person decide that someone else's no is just an obstacle rather than an answer. The door is not locked against him. What is locked is the farmhouse, with a deadbolt he doesn't have a key for, because trust is not the same as access, and I know the difference now in a way I didn't need to know before. The creek is running. The field is whatever color the light makes it today. The rocker is the one I bought at the auction in Pulaski, and it still moves the same way it always has. Back and forth on the porch boards, I refinished myself. In a house I own in full, in a life that belongs to me. That is the surprise I prepared. Not cameras or lawyers or locked gates, though all of those were part of it. The real surprise, the one my brother didn't see coming, was that I meant what I said, that my home was mine, that no was a complete sentence. That a man who has spent his life understanding what holds and what doesn't knows exactly how to protect the things worth keeping. He thought I'd come around. I was already exactly where I intended to be.